Hey guys, welcome back. Today we've got something absolutely insane. What if Deku inherited both One for All and All for One at the same time? Think about it. All for One literally ruled Japan for centuries with hundreds of stolen quirks, while One for All created the symbol of peace. Now imagine Deku getting both powers, but AFO's consciousness comes along trying to corrupt our pure boy into the ultimate villain. We're talking god-tier power with the most evil voice in history whispering in his head 24/7. This story follows Izuku's insane psychological battle as he fights to stay heroic while having access to reality-breaking abilities that could make him stronger than All Might and AFO combined. Smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Let's dive in. The air crackled with residual energy as smoke billowed across Kamino Ward, transforming the urban landscape into something resembling a war zone. From his position behind the police barricade, Izuku Midoriya pressed against the metal barrier, his green eyes wide with terror and fascination as he watched his mentor, his hero, face off against the most feared villain in Japan's history. All Might versus All for One. The final battle between the symbol of peace and the symbol of evil was everything the world had expected and more. Each collision of their fists sent shockwaves rippling through the air, shattering windows blocks away and making the very ground beneath Izuku's feet tremble. He should have been farther back, should have listened to the evacuation orders, but he couldn't tear himself away, not when All Might was fighting for everyone's future. Not when he was fighting with the last embers of One for All burning in his deteriorated body. United States of Smash. All Might's voice boomed across the battlefield as he prepared his ultimate attack, every ounce of his remaining power channeled into his fist. The sheer force of displaced air from the wind-up alone sent debris flying in all directions. Izuku watched in awe as his mentor, skeletal, weakened, but still the greatest hero alive, prepared to end this decades-long conflict once and for all. But something was wrong. All for One, even as he reeled from the devastating blow, was smiling. That terrible, knowing smile that had haunted Japan's nightmares for generations. His body was broken, his mask cracked, but his eyes were fixed not on All Might, but on something behind him. On Izuku. You cannot kill an idea, symbol of peace, All for One rasped, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Even in death, I endure. The words sent a chill down Izuku's spine, but before he could process their meaning fully, reality itself seemed to tear. The collision of All Might's ultimate attack with All for One's desperate final gambit created something unprecedented, a quirk singularity, a point where two incompatible forces met and the very fabric of quirk physics began to unravel. The air between the combatants rippled like water, space bending and twisting as dimensional barriers weakened. And Izuku, standing too close despite every warning, was suddenly pulled forward. Deku Bakugo's voice cut through the chaos, but it sounded distant, distorted. Time slowed to a crawl as Izuku felt himself lifted off his feet, drawn inexorably toward the epicenter of the collision. The world around him became a kaleidoscope of fractured light and impossible angles. He could see All Might's horrified face turning toward him, could see the moment his mentor realized what was happening, but it was too late. Too late to stop. Too late to change course. Too late to prevent what All for One had planned from the very beginning. The impact hit Izuku like a freight train made of pure energy. Every nerve in his body screamed as two of the most powerful quirks in existence, quirks that had defined an entire era of heroism and villainy, collided within his teenage frame. The pain was indescribable, like being torn apart and rebuilt at the molecular level while fully conscious. Through the agony, he heard voices. No, not like this, All Might's voice filled with anguish. Yes, exactly like this, All for One's voice triumphant even in defeat. And then, impossibly, other voices, older voices, the vestiges of One for All, crying out in alarm as their sacred power was forced to share space with its antithesis. Darkness claimed him. 3 days later. Izuku's eyes fluttered open to the sterile white ceiling of a hospital room. The steady beep of monitoring equipment filled the silence, and the antiseptic smell of medical facilities made his nose wrinkle. His body felt like he'd been hit by a truck, then put back together by someone who'd lost the instruction manual. Oh, thank goodness! His mother's voice broke through the fog of consciousness, and suddenly warm hands were holding his face, tears dropping onto his cheeks. Izuku, sweetheart, you're awake. Mom, his voice came out as a croak, throat dry as sandpaper. Everything felt different, like his body was humming with an energy that hadn't been there before. What happened? How long have I been? 3 days, came a familiar voice from the corner of the room. Izuku turned his head slowly, carefully, to see All Might sitting in a visitor's chair. But this wasn't the confident symbol of peace he remembered. This was Toshinori Yagi, looking older and more haggard than ever, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept since the incident. All Might, are you okay? Did we win? The questions tumbled out of Izuku despite his exhaustion. All for one is dead, Toshinori said quietly, but there was no triumph in his voice. But young Midoriya, what happened to you, what you were caught up in? I'm so sorry. Inko looked between them, confusion clear on her face. What are you talking about? The doctor said Izuku was caught in some kind of quirk backlash, but they couldn't determine the exact cause. They said his body showed signs of massive energy absorption, but that should be impossible for someone quirkless. Mom, Izuku's voice was soft but firm. Something was stirring inside him, a warmth that felt familiar yet foreign. I'm not quirkless anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. Slowly, carefully, Izuku raised his right hand. Without conscious thought, energy began to flow through his arm, the same green lightning he'd seen crackle around All Might countless times during training. But there was something else, something darker woven through the familiar power. A glass of water on his bedside table suddenly cracked. One for all successfully transferred to you during the incident, Toshinori said, his voice heavy with guilt. But something else happened too, something I've been researching for the past 3 days, trying to understand. I can explain that. The voice came from inside Izuku's head, smooth and cultured and absolutely terrifying. Izuku gasped, his hand flying to his temple as All Might shot to his feet. Young Midoriya, what's wrong? But Izuku could only stare in horror as the pieces fell into place. The voice he'd just heard was one he recognized from countless news reports, from All Might's stories, from his own nightmares since becoming aware of the criminal underworld. It was All for One's voice. Hello, successor, the voice continued, and now Izuku could feel the presence behind it, ancient, malevolent, amused. Surprised? You shouldn't be. Did you really think someone who has cheated death for over a century would let a little thing like physical destruction stop him? Izuku's breathing became rapid and shallow. No, this can't be happening. You're dead. All Might said you were dead. Izuku, Inko grabbed his shoulders, shaking him gently. Sweetheart, talk to me. What's wrong? She can't hear me, of course. No one can. This is between us now, my reluctant inheritor. All for One's voice was conversational, almost grandfatherly. Don't you understand? When your mentor's attack destroyed my body, I had mere seconds to act. I could die with my life's work unfinished, or I could ensure my survival the only way possible, by transferring my consciousness into the one person present who could theoretically contain it. That's impossible, Izuku whispered, but even as he said it, he could feel the truth of it. There was something else inside his mind now, something vast and dark and patient. Impossible, my boy, you're speaking to a man who has lived for 2 centuries by stealing the quirks of others. I have abilities your generation can't even imagine. Consciousness transfer is child's play when you've had as much practice with quirk manipulation as I have. The presence seemed to shift, like a predator getting comfortable. And now, through you, I have access to something I've coveted for decades, one for all. All Might was speaking to someone on his phone, probably Recovery Girl or Principal Nezu, his voice urgent and worried. Inko was still holding Izuku's shoulders, asking questions he couldn't process through the roar of panic in his head. Don't look so distressed, successor. This is a gift beyond measure. You now possess both One for All and All for One, the 2 greatest quirks in human history. Do you have any idea what we could accomplish together? I don't want to accomplish anything with you, Izuku hissed under his breath, trying not to alarm his mother further. Oh, but you will, you see, my boy, I'm not just a passenger in your mind. I'm part of you now, woven into your very consciousness. Every quirk I ever stole, every fragment of power I accumulated over 2 centuries, it's all here, waiting for you to access it. And eventually you will, they all do. To demonstrate his point, Izuku suddenly felt a catalog of quirks flash through his awareness. Hundreds of them. Air manipulation, strength enhancement, physical transformation, energy projection, an endless arsenal of stolen power just waiting to be used. And despite his horror, despite his revulsion at what All for One represented, Izuku felt a tiny, traitorous thrill at the scope of that power. There it is, All for One purred, that little spark of excitement. That's all I need to work with, my boy. In time, you'll come to see things my way. After all, with power like this, you could save everyone. Isn't that what you've always wanted? Izuku, his mother's voice seemed to come from very far away. Your eyes, they just changed color for a moment. What's happening? Izuku blinked, focusing on her face. She looked terrified, and he realized that whatever internal battle he was fighting, it was beginning to show externally. She's right to be afraid, All for One observed. Change is coming whether you accept it or not, but don't worry, I'm patient. I have all the time in the world now. After all, we're going to be spending the rest of your life together. Young Midoriya, All Might had finished his phone call and was approaching the bed cautiously. Can you hear me? Your vital signs just spiked dramatically. Izuku looked up at his mentor, the man who had given him everything, who had believed in him when no one else would, and felt his heart break. How could he explain that his greatest gift had become his greatest curse? How could he tell the symbol of peace that his final battle had not ended in victory, but in the creation of something potentially far more dangerous than what they'd started with? All Might, he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. I think we have a problem. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical tests, hushed conversations between adults, and an overwhelming sense that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. All Might eventually convinced the doctors to give them privacy, sending Inko to get some rest with promises that he would watch over her son. Once they were alone, Izuku told him everything. He described the voice in his head, the catalog of stolen quirks he could somehow sense, the presence that felt ancient and patient and utterly evil. All Might listened with growing horror, his already gaunt face becoming even more pale. This is my fault, Toshinori said when Izuku finished. If I had been stronger, if I had finished him before he could try this desperate gambit. Tell him it's not his fault, All for One interjected, sounding amused. Tell him this was always the plan. Even if he had been strong enough to kill me instantly, I had contingencies. This outcome was always a possibility. He says this was always part of his plan, Izuku relayed, feeling sick. Even if you'd killed him outright, he had ways to survive. All Might's hands clenched into fists. 200 years of planning, and he uses his final moments to corrupt my successor. It's exactly the kind of twisted victory he would find satisfying. Corrupt, my dear symbol of peace, I prefer to think of it as completion. One for All was always meant to be paired with its counterpart. Now your successor has access to the full spectrum of quirk evolution. In time, he'll thank me for it. What does he want? All Might asked. There has to be an endgame here. Izuku closed his eyes, trying to focus on the presence in his mind. The answer came not in words, but in images and emotions. A vision of a world where heroes and villains were obsolete, where one person with overwhelming power made all the decisions for everyone else's good. He wants to rule, Izuku said simply. Not through fear or violence, but through being so powerful that resistance becomes impossible. He thinks if I have enough power, I'll eventually decide that making decisions for everyone else is the only way to truly save them. And will you? All Might's question was quiet but intense. No, Izuku said immediately, then hesitated. I hope not, but All Might, I can feel how much power he's offering. It would be so easy to just take it, to stop worrying about whether I'm strong enough to save everyone and just have the power to do it. Exactly, All for One whispered approvingly. You understand perfectly. Why struggle and fail when you could simply succeed? Why watch people suffer when you have the power to fix everything? All Might reached over and grasped Izuku's shoulder firmly. Because that's not what heroes do, my boy. Heroes don't impose their will on others, no matter how good their intentions. Heroes inspire people to save themselves. Pretty words from a man who spent decades making unilateral decisions about who lived and who died. How many villains did you defeat instead of trying to understand? How many problems did you solve with your fists instead of addressing their root causes? Despite himself, Izuku found the words hitting home. All Might was a great hero, but he'd operated largely alone, making split-second decisions that affected thousands of lives. Was that really so different from what All for One was proposing? I can see it in your eyes, All Might said quietly. He's already starting to work on you, isn't he? Making you question everything you believe about heroism. I'm not making him question anything, I'm simply providing perspective. After all, we have plenty of time to discuss philosophy, all the time in the world. Izuku shuddered. The thought of spending the rest of his life with that voice in his head, constantly offering power and questioning his choices, was almost unbearable. "We'll figure this out," All Might said firmly. "I don't care what it takes or how long it takes. We'll find a way to remove his influence and restore you to normal." "Oh, my dear symbol of peace, still so optimistic, even in the face of the impossible. Tell me, boy." All for One's attention turned back to Izuku. "What happens when you go to sleep tonight? What happens when your conscious mind relaxes its guard? Do you think your heroic resolve will be quite so strong in your dreams?" The thought sent ice through Izuku's veins. He'd been awake for less than a day with this presence in his head, and already he could feel its influence. What would happen over weeks, months, years of constant psychological pressure? As if reading his thoughts, All Might squeezed his shoulder tighter. "You're not alone in this, young Midoriya. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we'll face this together. I promise you that." "Promises are easy to make," All for One observed. "Much harder to keep. Especially when the person you're trying to save starts to realize that you're holding them back from their true potential." But looking into All Might's eyes, tired, worried, but absolutely determined, Izuku felt a small spark of hope. He'd inherited not just power, but a legacy of heroism that stretched back 8 generations. Surely that had to count for something against one man's evil, no matter how patient or clever he might be. "We shall see," All for One said, as if reading his thoughts. "After all, we have nothing but time, and I've learned that everyone breaks eventually, even heroes." The room fell quiet except for the steady beep of medical equipment. Outside the window, the sun was setting over a city that had no idea how much danger it was potentially in. Izuku closed his eyes and tried to shut out the voice in his head, tried to focus on the familiar warmth of One for All flowing through his body. But underneath that warmth, like a shadow cast by a bright light, he could feel something else. Something vast and dark and patient, waiting for its moment to emerge. The battle for Izuku Midoriya's soul had begun. And unlike the fight in Kamino Ward, this one would have no witnesses, no cheering crowds, no clear moment of victory or defeat. This would be a war fought in the quiet moments, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the dark hours when even heroes sometimes doubted themselves. As he drifted off to sleep despite his efforts to stay awake, Izuku's last conscious thought was a prayer to whatever gods might be listening. "Please don't let me become the thing I've always feared." In response, he thought he heard laughter, soft, cultured, and absolutely terrifying. The laughter of someone who had just been handed the keys to unlimited power and all the time in the world to figure out how to use them. The first night was the worst. Izuku had hoped that sleep might provide some escape from All for One's presence, but instead it only made things worse. In his dreams, the villain's consciousness roamed freely, unrestricted by Izuku's waking mental defenses. He found himself standing in a vast library where every book contained the memories and abilities of AFO's victims, hundreds of quirks cataloged and organized like specimens in a collection. "Welcome to your inheritance, my boy," All for One's voice echoed through the dreamscape, no longer confined to whispers but speaking with the full authority of someone in their own domain. 2 centuries of careful acquisition, all waiting for you to claim. Dream Izuku walked through the aisles, pulled by a curiosity he couldn't suppress. Each book he passed showed glimpses of the quirks within: a flame manipulator who had used his power to burn down orphanages, a mind reader who had driven victims insane with their deepest secrets, a healer who had prolonged suffering for his own amusement. "You're focusing on their crimes," All for One observed, appearing beside him in the form of a well-dressed gentleman rather than the nightmare figure from the news. "But consider their power. That flame manipulator could have heated homes for the poor. The mind reader could have solved crimes and prevented suffering. The healer could have saved thousands. They simply lacked proper guidance." "They were villains," Izuku said, though his voice lacked conviction in this place where AFO's influence was strongest. "They were tools that were misused. In your hands, with your heroic heart, imagine what good they could do. Imagine how many people you could save." Izuku jerked awake at 3 a.m., his sheets soaked with sweat and his heart pounding. The dream had felt more real than reality, and worse, he could still sense every quirk AFO had shown him. They weren't just memories anymore, they were options, possibilities hanging in the back of his mind like weapons in an armory. 3 weeks later, UA High School. "Midoriya, your performance has been inconsistent lately," Aizawa said after class, his tired eyes studying Izuku with concern. Your written work is actually improving, but your practical exercises are suffering. You seem distracted." Izuku fidgeted with his notebook, trying to avoid his teacher's penetrating gaze. How could he explain that he was spending half his energy fighting off suggestions from the most dangerous villain in history, that every training exercise became a battle between using his legitimate power and the tempting shortcuts AFO offered? "Tell him about the villain from last week," All for One suggested with amusement. "The one with the corrosive touch quirk. You could have ended that fight in seconds if you'd simply taken his ability and turned it against him." "I'm just adjusting to one for all," Izuku said, which was technically true. The power increase has been harder to manage than expected. Aizawa's expression softened slightly. "I can understand that. All Might mentioned your quirk had evolved significantly after the Kamino incident, but Midoriya, if you're having control issues, you need to speak up. We can arrange additional training, medical supervision, whatever you need." "He's offering you exactly what you need," AFO pointed out. "Additional training to help you master your abilities, all of your abilities. Wouldn't it be more efficient to simply demonstrate your full capabilities?" "I'm fine," Izuku said quickly, then immediately regretted how defensive it sounded. "I mean, I'll work on it. The control issues. I'll figure it out." Aizawa studied him for a long moment. "Very well, but Midoriya, pride isn't worth endangering yourself or your classmates. If you need help, ask for it." As his teacher left, Izuku slumped in his seat. He wanted help desperately, but how could he ask for it? How could he tell anyone that he was carrying the consciousness of Japan's greatest villain in his head? Later that day, training ground beta. "Deku, what the hell is wrong with you?" Bakugo demanded during their combat exercise. "You're fighting like you're scared of your own quirk." Izuku dodged another explosive blast, his movements more cautious than usual. Bakugo was right, he was holding back, terrified of what might happen if he fully engaged with his power. Every time he started to let One for All flow freely, he could feel All for One's presence stirring, offering enhancements, suggesting combinations with stolen quirks that would make him unstoppable. "The boy is right, you know," AFO observed as Izuku barely avoided a particularly large explosion. "You're fighting with one hand tied behind your back. I can give you a dozen quirks that would end this match instantly. Heat resistance to ignore his explosions, precognition to predict his attacks, enhanced speed to outmaneuver him completely." "I don't need your help," Izuku muttered under his breath, then immediately had to throw himself sideways as Bakugo's next attack nearly took his head off. "Don't you? You're about to lose to someone you've already surpassed in raw power. How is that heroic? How does losing help anyone?" Despite his determination to resist, Izuku could feel the quirks AFO was offering. Heat resistance pulsed temptingly in the back of his mind as another explosion singed his hero costume. Enhanced reflexes called to him as Bakugo's attacks came faster and more aggressive. It would be so easy, just a little borrowed power, nothing that would hurt anyone, just enough to level the playing field. "That's it," AFO encouraged. "Just a touch of enhancement, you've earned it." For a split second, Izuku felt something else flow through him alongside One for All. His reflexes sharpened dramatically, time seeming to slow as Bakugo telegraphed his next attack. Without thinking, Izuku moved with impossible precision, flowing around the explosion like water and delivering a perfectly controlled strike to Bakugo's solar plexus. Bakugo hit the ground hard, unconscious before he landed. "Excellent," All for One purred. "See how much more effective you are when you stop limiting yourself, and that was barely a fraction of what I can offer you." Izuku stared at his hand in horror. The borrowed quirk, enhanced reflexes, and combat prediction was already fading, but he could feel how easily he could call it back. How natural it had felt to use power that wasn't his. Midoriya, All Might appeared at his side, having been observing from the sidelines. "What happened? That was an impressive display, but Bakugo seems to be injured." "I didn't mean to hit him that hard," Izuku said quickly, kneeling beside his unconscious classmate. Everything slowed down and I could see exactly where to strike and." He cut himself off, realizing he was describing abilities he shouldn't have. All Might's eyes narrowed slightly, and Izuku could see the moment his mentor realized something was very wrong. "Young Midoriya," All Might said carefully, "that kind of combat precognition isn't typically associated with One for All. In fact, it sounds remarkably similar to a quirk that All for One demonstrated during our battles." AFO interrupted with satisfaction. He's figured it out. Quicker than I expected, actually. I suppose decades of fighting me gave him some insight into my methods. Izuku's face must have shown his panic because All Might immediately moved to shield him from the other students, speaking in a low, urgent voice. We need to talk immediately. Meet me in my office after classes end. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety and AFO's running commentary on every interaction, every lesson, every moment of weakness or doubt. By the time Izuku reached All Might's office, he felt like his head was going to explode from the constant mental pressure. You know, All for One said as Izuku knocked on the door, it doesn't have to be this difficult. Stop fighting what you are and accept what you could become. The mental strain you're experiencing, that's resistance. Stop resisting and the pain stops. Kamen's young Midoriya. All Might's office was sparse but comfortable, with a few hero memorabilia pieces and a large window overlooking the training grounds. His mentor sat behind his desk in his civilian form, looking more serious than Izuku had ever seen him. Show me, All Might said without preamble. Show you what? The quirk you used against Bakugo, the one that isn't one for all. Izuku's hands trembled as he held them up. With enormous reluctance, he reached into the dark catalog in his mind and called forth the enhanced reflexes quirk. The world immediately sharpened around him, his perception accelerating until he could see dust motes hanging in the air, could track the minute changes in All Might's expression as he recognized what he was seeing. Beautiful, isn't it? AFO whispered. And this is nothing. I have quirks that could let you see through walls, read minds, manipulate gravity itself. Why settle for being just another strong hero when you could be something unprecedented? How many? All Might asked quietly. Izuku let the quirk fade and slumped in his chair. I don't know, hundreds maybe. He shows me new ones all the time, trying to tempt me. Says they're all mine to use, that I just have to accept them. And have you accepted them, I mean? I try not to, Izuku said miserably. But sometimes when I'm scared or angry or just tired of fighting him, it's so easy to just reach out and take what he's offering. Like with Bakugo today. I didn't even mean to do it, but the power was right there and it felt good, All for One finished. Admit it, boy, for those few seconds when you moved with perfect precision and complete confidence, you felt more like a true hero than you ever have before. Yes, Izuku whispered, and the admission felt like a knife in his chest. It did feel good. It felt, right, like that's what I was supposed to be able to do. All Might was quiet for a long time, studying Izuku with an expression of deep concern. Finally, he spoke. My boy, I need you to understand something very important. The feeling you just described, that sense of rightness when you use power that isn't yours, that's exactly how All for One wants you to feel. It's the first step down a path that leads nowhere good. The path to unlimited power and the ability to save everyone, AFO countered. Tell me, symbol of peace, how many people died while you were too weak to save them? How many villains escaped because you lacked the precise tools needed to stop them? Your successor doesn't have to face those limitations. He's saying I could save more people this way, Izuku said, hatting himself for voicing AFO's arguments but unable to stop. That with access to the right quirks, I'd never have to watch people suffer because I wasn't strong enough or fast enough or smart enough to help them. And what happens when you decide that people are making the wrong choices for themselves? All Might asked. When you have the power to make their decisions for them, when you become convinced that your judgment is better than their freedom. I wouldn't, Izuku started, then stopped, because as he thought about it, he could imagine scenarios where those choices might seem justified. A suicidal person who needed to be stopped, a criminal who refused rehabilitation, a politician making decisions that hurt innocent people. Exactly, All for One said with satisfaction. You're already starting to understand. Power without the will to use it properly is just an elaborate form of cowardice. True heroism requires making the hard choices that others can't or won't make. I don't know how to fight him, Izuku admitted to All Might. He's in my head all the time, commenting on everything, offering solutions to every problem. And the worst part is, sometimes his solutions make sense. All Might leaned forward, his expression intense. Then we need to find you help, real help from people who understand quirk psychology and mental defense techniques. This isn't something you can handle alone. Help from whom? Other heroes who have never faced a challenge like this, psychologists who don't understand quirk-based consciousness transfer. Face facts, boy, you're in uncharted territory. The only one who truly understands your situation is me. What if there isn't any help? Izuku asked. What if this is just who I am now, someone carrying both one for all and all for one? Then we find a way to make it work, All Might said firmly. We find a way for you to be a hero despite what he's done to you, but Midoriya, I need you to promise me something. What? Promise me that before you make any major decisions, before you use his quirks in public, before you trust his advice about anything important, you'll talk to someone first. Me, Aizawa, someone you trust. Don't let him isolate you. Isolation, my boy, I'm offering you connection to centuries of accumulated experience and power. What could your mentor possibly offer that compares to that? I promise, Izuku said, though even as he said it, he could feel AFO's amusement at what the villain clearly saw as a meaningless gesture. As Izuku left All Might's office, his head pounding from the constant mental pressure, he realized that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. He wasn't just carrying the hopes of previous one for all users anymore. He was carrying the concentrated evil of Japan's greatest villain, and that evil was patient, persuasive, and absolutely convinced that it knew what was best for everyone. That night, as he lay in his dorm room trying to fall asleep, AFO's voice was softer than usual, almost gentle. You don't have to be afraid of me, you know. I'm not your enemy, I'm your potential. Together, we could build a world where no one suffers unnecessarily, where every problem has a solution, where heroes never have to make impossible choices because they have the power to make all choices possible. And all it would cost is everyone's freedom, Izuku muttered into his pillow. Freedom to make wrong choices, freedom to hurt themselves and others, freedom to perpetuate systems that cause suffering. Tell me, my boy, what is freedom worth if people use it to destroy themselves? Izuku didn't have an answer for that, and as he finally drifted off to sleep, he found himself wondering if that was the point, if AFO wasn't trying to give him answers but trying to teach him to ask the wrong questions. In his dreams, he found himself back in the library of stolen quirks, but this time he wasn't just browsing. This time he was taking notes. And somewhere in the dark recesses of his mind, All for One smiled. The decision to tell Todoroki came during a particularly brutal training session where Izuku had nearly lost control 3 separate times. Each incident had been small, a quirk flickering to life for just a moment, enhanced strength beyond what One for All should provide, reflexes that belonged to someone else entirely. But they were getting more frequent, and Izuku was running out of excuses. You're fighting a war on 2 fronts, All for One observed as Izuku sat alone in the locker room after everyone else had left. External training and internal resistance. No wonder you're exhausted. It would be so much easier to simply accept my gifts and excel without this constant struggle. Izuku ignored the voice as he'd been trying to do for weeks now, but the headache that followed his resistance was getting worse. The mental strain of constantly fighting AFO's influence was beginning to show in everything he did. His grades were slipping, his combat performance was erratic, and his friends were starting to ask questions he couldn't answer. He needed help, real help, and despite All Might's promise to find professional assistance, weeks had passed without any real progress. The quirk psychologists All Might had consulted were baffled by the concept of consciousness transfer, and the few who took it seriously wanted to study Izuku like a lab specimen rather than help him. Which left him with civilian friends who couldn't possibly understand, or classmates who might understand but couldn't be trusted with a secret this dangerous. Except for one. Todoroki Shoto had his own experience with inherited darkness. His father's legacy hung over him like a shadow, and he'd spent years learning to separate his own identity from the power he'd inherited. If anyone could understand the conflict between rejecting a corrupted gift and needing to use it for heroic purposes, it would be him. The next day, Izuku approached Todoroki after their final class. Hey Todoroki, could we talk privately? Shoto looked up from packing his notebooks, heterochromatic eyes studying Izuku's face with characteristic intensity. You look terrible, Midoriya. When was the last time you slept? I sleep, Izuku protested, though it wasn't entirely true. Sleep meant dreams, and dreams meant being fully at AFO's mercy. I need advice about inherited power, about dealing with something you don't want but can't get rid of. Something shifted in Todoroki's expression. My father. No, not, it's complicated. Can we go somewhere private? Training ground gamma maybe, after dinner. Todoroki studied him for another long moment, then nodded. I'll meet you there at 8. Training ground gamma 8:00 p.m. The industrial training facility was empty and quiet, with only the distant hum of the school's power systems breaking the silence. Izuku had chosen this location specifically because it was isolated and had numerous hiding spots if anyone came looking for them. Todoroki arrived exactly on time, as Izuku had known he would. His friend's punctuality was one of many things he found reassuring in a world where AFO constantly whispered about chaos and change. Todoroki's reliability was an anchor to normalcy. So, Todoroki said without preamble, what inherited power are you dealing with that you can't tell anyone else about? Straight to the point, I like this one. AFO's voice carried a note of approval that made Izuku's skin crawl. He might actually be useful. Strong mind, clear priorities, and enough family trauma to understand pragmatic choices. Izuku started, then stopped. How did you tell your friend that you were carrying the consciousness of the most feared villain in history? How did you explain that every day was a battle not to become exactly what everyone feared most? Midoriya, Todoroki's voice was patient but firm. Whatever it is, it's eating you alive. I can see it in the way you move, the way you hesitate during training, the way you look like you're fighting a war inside your own head. Just tell me. So Izuku did. He started with Kamino Ward, with being pulled into the epicenter of the battle between All Might and All for One. He explained about the quirk singularity, about inheriting not just one for all but its antithesis as well. He described the voice in his head, the catalog of stolen quirks, the constant temptation and psychological pressure. Todoroki listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave as the full scope of Izuku's situation became clear. Show me, Todoroki said when Izuku finished. What? Show me these stolen quirks. If you want me to understand what you're dealing with, I need to see it. Oh, this is interesting. Most people would run screaming. He wants a demonstration. Give him one he'll remember. Izuku hesitated, then slowly raised his hand. With enormous reluctance, he reached into AFO's catalog and selected something relatively harmless, a quirk that allowed him to create small ice crystals in the air, similar to but distinct from Todoroki's own ice power. The temperature around them dropped noticeably as delicate frost patterns began forming in the air between his fingers. The quirk felt alien, wrong in a way that One for All never did, but also seductively powerful. Todoroki's eyes widened. That's remarkably similar to my ice creation, but the crystalline structure is different, more complex. He paused, studying Izuku's face. How does it feel, using someone else's quirk? Wrong, Izuku said immediately, then reconsidered. But also, natural, like it was always supposed to be mine. AFO says that's because quirks want to be used, and I'm giving them purpose again instead of letting them sit dormant. Very good, you're learning to articulate the philosophy properly. AFO, Todoroki's voice was sharp. All for one, the consciousness is still active. As if summoned by his name, AFO's presence seemed to surge forward, and when Izuku spoke next, his voice carried an odd double tone. Hello, young Todoroki, your friend has told me so much about you. Another child damaged by a hero's obsession with power and legacy. We have more in common than you might think. Todoroki took a step back, his left side beginning to frost over as his quirk responded to his alarm. That's not Midoriya talking. Oh, but it is. I'm simply helping him express thoughts he's been having but hasn't been brave enough to voice. Tell me, boy, how many times has your father disappointed you? How many times have you wished you had the power to simply make him stop? Get out of his head, Todoroki said, ice beginning to spread across the ground around his feet. I'm not in his head, I am part of his head now. But don't worry, I'm not going to hurt him. Quite the opposite. I'm going to help him become everything he was meant to be, a hero with the power to actually fix things instead of just bandaging them. The double tone faded as Izuku reasserted control, but the effort left him gasping and holding his temples. Sorry, he gets stronger when I'm stressed or tired. I usually have better control than that. Usually, Todoroki's ice didn't retreat. How often does he take over? He doesn't usually take over completely, Izuku said. It's more like suggestions, whispers. He shows me solutions to problems, offers power to handle difficult situations, points out flaws in people's reasoning. And the worst part is, Todoroki, sometimes he's right. Todoroki was quiet for a long moment, studying Izuku with an intensity that made him want to squirm. Finally, his friend spoke. My father used to tell me that power without control was worthless, he said. But he was wrong. Power without moral foundation is what's truly worthless. It doesn't matter how right someone's solutions are if they're willing to sacrifice people's freedom to implement them. Freedom to make wrong choices, freedom to hurt themselves and others, freedom to perpetuate suffering when simple solutions exist. Your friend understands the limitations of such freedom. He's lived with a father who used his right to choose to abuse his family for years. He's in my head again, Izuku said, though this time AFO wasn't controlling his voice. He's saying that freedom to make wrong choices isn't really freedom at all. And what do you think? Izuku was quiet for a moment, genuinely considering the question. I think he might be right about freedom being complicated, but I also think that taking away people's right to make their own mistakes is worse than letting them fail. Even when those mistakes hurt innocent people, even when you have the power to prevent suffering but choose not to use it out of respect for abstract principles. Even then, Izuku said firmly, though he could feel AFO's amusement at what the villain clearly saw as naive idealism. Todoroki nodded slowly. Good, that's the difference between you and him. You're willing to accept that some suffering might be inevitable if the alternative is tyranny. He's convinced that his judgment is better than everyone else's freedom. But what if he's right? Izuku asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in his mind for weeks. What if I do have the power to fix things and I'm just too scared to use it? What if my respect for people's freedom is really just cowardice? Now you're asking the right questions. Then you use that fear, Todoroki said. You use the doubt and the questioning to keep yourself honest. The moment you stop questioning whether you're doing the right thing is the moment you become him. Or the moment you become effective. Doubt is paralysis, boy, certainty is action. How do you deal with it? Izuku asked. With inheriting power from someone you don't want to become. By remembering that the power isn't what made him evil, his choices were. Your quirks don't define you, Midoriya, how you choose to use them does. They spent the next 2 hours in the training ground, with Todoroki helping Izuku experiment with different stolen quirks in a controlled environment. It was the first time since inheriting AFO's consciousness that Izuku had been able to explore his abilities without judgment or fear. This one is interesting, AFO noted as Izuku demonstrated a quirk that allowed him to see the structural weaknesses in materials. Originally belonged to a villain who used it to collapse buildings. In your hands, it could be used to assess damage after disasters, to determine which buildings are safe for evacuation. Same power, completely different application. He's right, Izuku admitted reluctantly. This quirk could be incredibly useful for rescue operations, and it's not like I'm hurting anyone by using it. The danger, Todoroki observed, isn't in using quirks like that. It's in getting comfortable with using his power, even for good reasons. What happens when the line between acceptable and unacceptable gets blurrier? What happens when rigid adherence to arbitrary rules prevents you from saving someone who could be saved with just a little moral flexibility? That's the real question, isn't it? Izuku said. Where's the line? At what point does using AFO's power to help people become using AFO's power to control them? I don't know, Todoroki admitted, but I think the fact that you're asking that question means you're not there yet. As they prepared to leave the training ground, Todoroki turned to Izuku with a serious expression. I want to help you with this. Regular training sessions, someone to talk through the moral questions with, backup if you start losing control, but I need you to promise me something. What? Promise me that if you ever stop questioning whether you're doing the right thing, if you ever reach a point where AFO's solutions start sounding completely reasonable, you'll tell me immediately. Don't try to handle it alone. He's asking you to promise to betray yourself when you finally start thinking clearly. Interesting strategy. I promise, Izuku said and meant it, though AFO's laughter suggested the villain found the oath amusing rather than concerning. That night, as Izuku lay in bed replaying the conversation, he realized that for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel completely alone. Having someone who understood the complexity of his situation, who could help him navigate the moral questions without judging him for asking them, was an enormous relief. "Your friend is intelligent," AFO observed, "and his advice isn't entirely wrong. But tell me, boy, what happens when his moral certainty conflicts with your growing understanding of what's necessary? What happens when his rigid principles prevent you from saving someone you care about?" "Then I'll figure out another way," Izuku said firmly. "We shall see. After all, principles are much easier to maintain when they haven't been truly tested. When the stakes get high enough, everyone learns to be pragmatic, even heroes." Despite AFO's cynicism, Izuku felt more hopeful than he had in weeks. He had an ally now, someone who understood the burden of inherited darkness and could help him carry it without being crushed by it. What he didn't know was that AFO was equally pleased with this development. The villain had learned long ago that isolation was only one path to corruption. Sometimes, having the right kind of support that asked the right questions and normalized the gradual erosion of absolute principles, could be even more effective. As both Izuku and AFO settled in for the night, each was convinced they had gained exactly what they needed from the evening's revelations. Only time would tell which of them was right. The close call happened during a routine rescue simulation. Izuku was working with a team to extract civilians from a collapsed building when he spotted a support beam about to give way above a trapped victim, one of the first-year students participating in the exercise. Without thinking, he reached out with a stolen quirk that allowed him to manipulate metal, reinforcing the beam with perfect precision. It was exactly the kind of life-saving application that AFO had been advocating for weeks. It was also completely impossible to explain. "Beautifully done," All for One praised as the exercise concluded successfully. "Not a single person harmed, maximum efficiency, minimal property damage. This is what heroism looks like when you stop limiting yourself with arbitrary restrictions." But Izuku could see Aizawa watching him from across the training ground, those tired eyes sharp with suspicion. His homeroom teacher had noticed something, and given Aizawa's reputation for observational skills, it was only a matter of time before difficult questions started being asked. The conversation came sooner than expected. "Midori in my office now." The words were delivered with Aizawa's typical economy of expression, but Izuku could hear the underlying tension. As they walked through the halls of UA, he found himself cataloging escape routes and defensive options, a paranoid habit that AFO had been encouraging. "Relax, boy, he's not your enemy, not yet anyway, though his quirk could pose complications if he chose to become problematic." Aizawa's office was as Spartan as the man himself, a desk, 2 chairs, filing cabinets, and a sleeping bag rolled up in the corner. No personal touches, no decoration, nothing to distract from the business at hand. "Sit," Aizawa commanded, settling behind his desk and fixing Izuku with that unblinking stare that had unnerved countless students over the years. "Now, explain to me how a student with a strength enhancement quirk managed to perform precision metal manipulation during today's exercise." Izuku's mouth went dry. "I don't know what you mean, sensei, I didn't." "Don't," Aizawa's voice was flat, dangerous. "Don't insult my intelligence by lying to me. I've been teaching for years, Midoriya. I know what every quirk in my class can and cannot do. What you did today was impossible unless you have access to abilities you haven't declared." "Ah, caught red-handed, how embarrassing. Still, this could be an opportunity. Aizawa-sensei is practical above all else. He might understand the necessity of using all available tools to save lives." Izuku started, then stopped. The weight of weeks of secret-keeping, of constant mental battle, of lying to everyone he cared about suddenly felt unbearable. "I need to call Todoroki." Aizawa raised an eyebrow. "Todoroki, why?" "Because he already knows, and I think I'm going to need moral support for this conversation." 20 minutes later, Todoroki sat in the spare chair while Aizawa listened with growing incredulity as Izuku explained his situation for the 3rd time in as many weeks. Unlike All Might's emotional reaction or Todoroki's philosophical interest, Aizawa's response was purely analytical. "Show me," he said when Izuku finished. "Sensei, demonstrate these stolen quirks. I need to understand the scope of what we're dealing with." With Todoroki's encouraging nod, Izuku began cycling through some of the less dangerous abilities in AFO's catalog. Enhanced reflexes that made him untouchable for 30 seconds. A quirk that let him see the molecular structure of materials. Another that allowed him to generate small amounts of different elements from his fingertips. Impressive display, though perhaps you should show him something with more impact. How about the quirk that allows you to temporarily steal other people's quirks? That would certainly get his attention. No, Izuku said firmly, cutting off the demonstration. Know what? Aizawa asked. AFO was suggesting I use a quirk that could steal other people's abilities temporarily. I won't do that. Aizawa was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he'd seen and heard. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. This is the biggest security risk UA has ever faced. Sensei, Todoroki started, but Aizawa held up a hand. I'm not finished. It's also potentially the greatest asset we've ever had access to. The question is, which one are you going to become? Now there's a man who understands reality, asset or threat, tool or weapon. At least he's not wasting time with naive moralizing about the sanctity of quirk ownership. I want to be a hero, Izuku said. I want to help people, but I don't know how to do that without risking becoming the thing everyone's afraid of. Then we figure it out together, Aizawa said pragmatically. First priority, containment. This information doesn't leave this room without unanimous agreement from everyone present. Second priority, assessment. We need to understand exactly what you're capable of and what the risks are. Third priority, training. If you're going to have these abilities, you're going to learn to use them safely. Todoroki leaned forward. You're not going to report this to the administration. With what outcome? Aizawa asked. Best case scenario, they try to study him like a lab specimen. Worst case, they decide he's too dangerous and try to contain or neutralize him. Neither of those outcomes serves anyone's interests. I like this teacher. He thinks in terms of practical outcomes rather than idealistic principles. This could be very useful. Over the next hour, Aizawa methodically worked through the implications of Izuku's situation. They established protocols for training sessions, communication methods for emergencies, and criteria for determining when, if ever, it might be safe to expand their circle of trust. The good news, Aizawa said, is that your moral foundation seems solid. You're questioning the right things, resisting temptation, seeking guidance instead of making unilateral decisions. That suggests you're not in immediate danger of corruption. The bad news, Izuku asked. The bad news is that moral foundations can erode under pressure. We need to monitor your psychological state as carefully as your quirk development. Any sign that you're starting to rationalize harmful actions, any indication that you're becoming comfortable with overriding other people's autonomy, and we reassess everything. Psychological monitoring, how clinical, though I suppose it's better than outright rejection. This teacher might actually help you reach your full potential, albeit slowly and with unnecessary moral hand-wringing. What about AFO's consciousness? Todoroki asked. Is there any way to remove or suppress it? Aizawa was quiet for a moment. I've been researching that since this conversation started. Consciousness transfer through quirks is theoretically possible but unprecedented in documented cases. My working theory is that All for One's quirk is so fundamentally tied to identity theft and absorption that it naturally preserves the consciousness of its primary user. So I'm stuck with him forever, Izuku said, though he'd already suspected as much. Not stuck, boy, blessed. How many people get access to 2 centuries of accumulated wisdom and experience? Though I suppose your teacher is right that gradual integration is probably safer than sudden acceptance. Maybe, Aizawa said, but even if we can't remove him, we can potentially limit his influence. Quirk suppression techniques, meditation practices, psychological conditioning, there are ways to strengthen your mental defenses. They spent another hour developing a training regimen specifically designed for Izuku's unique situation. Combat exercises that would help him integrate his abilities safely. Mental conditioning techniques borrowed from hero psychology courses. Regular assessment sessions to monitor his psychological state. One more thing, Aizawa said as they prepared to leave. All Might needs to know about this development, and we should consider whether Recovery Girl's medical expertise might be useful. Your circle of trust is expanding rapidly. Each new person is another potential point of failure, another chance for your secret to spread beyond your control. Though I suppose that's better than the alternative. Trying to handle this completely alone led to today's sloppy display of abilities. AFO says expanding our circle is risky, Izuku reported. More people means more chances for the secret to get out. He's not wrong, Aizawa admitted, but the alternative is you handling this alone, and today proved that's not sustainable. We need a support network that can provide oversight, guidance, and backup if things go wrong. As they left Aizawa's office, Izuku felt a complex mix of relief and apprehension. Having adult supervision and professional guidance was enormously reassuring, but it also made his situation feel more real, more permanent. This wasn't a temporary crisis to be endured, this was his new reality, and he was going to need help learning to navigate it. Your teacher is right about one thing, AFO observed as they walked through the empty halls. This is your new reality. The question is whether you're going to spend your life fighting what you are, or whether you're going to embrace what you could become. I know what I could become, Izuku replied silently. I've seen enough of your memories to know exactly what that path leads to. Have you, or have you seen what that path led to for someone with different goals, different values, different support systems? You're not me, boy. With your heroic instincts and moral guidance, you could use this power to build something I never even attempted, a truly just world. The thought was seductive, and Izuku found himself considering it despite his better judgment. What would the world look like if someone with genuine heroic intentions had access to unlimited power? What problems could be solved? What suffering could be prevented? That's the spirit. Dream bigger than your predecessors ever dared. After all, you have advantages they never possessed: moral clarity, institutional support, and most importantly, me to guide you away from their mistakes. That night, alone in his dorm room, Izuku stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything that had happened. His secret was spreading, his support network was growing, and his internal conflict was becoming more complex rather than simpler. But for the first time since inheriting AFO's consciousness, he felt like he might actually have a chance of staying true to his heroic ideals while managing the power he'd inherited. With All Might's inspiration, Todoroki's understanding, and Aizawa's practical guidance, maybe he could find a way to be the hero he'd always dreamed of becoming. Even if that hero looked very different from what anyone had expected. Sleep well, young hero. Tomorrow we begin the real work, not just learning to use your abilities, but learning to embrace them. After all, the world needs saving, and you're the only one with the tools to do it properly. As AFO's voice faded into the background noise of his mind, Izuku found himself looking forward to tomorrow's training session with an anticipation that worried him. Was he eager to learn better control over dangerous abilities, or was he starting to look forward to using power that wasn't rightfully his? The distinction, he was beginning to realize, might be more important than he'd initially understood.
And that's how Deku went from terrified kid with a villain in his head to the hero who revolutionized everything. That mental battle with the vestiges was epic, and seeing him transform AFO's dark legacy into something beautiful. Absolutely perfect. What was your favorite moment? The reality-bending rescue or that emotional reveal to his mom? Drop it in the comments. Subscribe for more insane MHA concepts and drop your what-if ideas below. Peace out.